I want to clue you in again to the liturgical year because it's a little confusing in relationship to the calendar. The Roman calendar, that is, the one that has the months that we all agree on. This is the season of Pentecost, the season of ordinary time, and it is almost drawn to a conclusion. Next Sunday will be the last Sunday of the season of Pentecost. It is called Christ the King Sunday, in which we remember Christ's kingship. And then we begin the season of Advent, which is the start of the church's liturgical year. That'll be the Sunday after Thanksgiving. Next week, we will remember Jesus' kingship. It's a youngest among us service, and we will have materials available for you for your Advent wreath to take home, since Advent often surprises all of us because it's right after Thanksgiving. So our readings today have to do with Jesus' kingdom, the kingdom of which he is king. What kind of kingdom is Jesus building? It is definitely one that we want, but not one that we can realize on our own. As the disciples point out in our gospel lesson today, these big stones on top of one another, they are drawing Jesus' attention to the efforts of humanity over the years to establish God's kingdom. This is the temple that is being built. But we can't bring about God's kingdom by our own determination. And God has made it so. God has made it so that the only way that we can bring about Christ's kingdom is by submitting to God's lordship in our lives. We will see it grow in us, Christ's lordship. And all along, we will know that it is beyond our capacity to build what Christ is building through us. We will feel both humbled and strengthened, humbled and exalted by the growth that comes about by Jesus working in us. Jesus' description of what will precede his kingdom being established reminds us that evil does not go quietly. The ways of the world are always going to fight to the bitter end. There will be wars and rumors of wars, he tells his disciples. And indeed, we will be wondering who is the right side to suit up for. Which outfit should we put on? Whose voice should we tune our ears to? What weapons do we need to be counted among the loyal to this king? In next week's gospel reading, which is from John, Pilate will ask Jesus if he is a king, and Jesus will say, "My kingdom is not of this world, for if it were, my people would be fighting for me." And there is the hint to us of what it means for Christ's lordship in our lives. We can deduce that to be of Jesus' kingdom, fighting doesn't happen with the weapons built of man. Fighting happens with the tools of the kingdom, which are not the ways of this world. Jesus lays out the keys to the kingdom in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel, which begins in chapter 5 of Matthew's Gospel. Jesus says that he has come to fulfill the law, not to abolish it. The summary of the law is here on our wall, as you see. The 10 Commandments were the law given to Moses, but in summary, it's 2. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. 10 is a lot to remember. You might make it as far as 9, but you can definitely remember 2. In the summary, in the law, the 10 Commandments, we hear the negative: do not, do not, do not. Do not commit murder. Do not commit adultery. But what is the positive that we are asked to do? We know not to murder, but what should we do instead? What can I do that if I allow it to carry me to the extreme, I will find myself better than I imagined, that I will find myself in a new reality? Jesus does give this instruction in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel, starting with the 5th chapter. Here are some of the directions he gives, some of the positives, if you will, what it is that we are to do as we become part of God's kingdom. Blessed are the poor in spirit, he says, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. On this side, you see a couple of these Beatitudes. Søren Kierkegaard was a Danish theologian, among other things. He lived during the first half of the 19th century. He died in 1855 at the age of 42. I want to share with you a small piece of his writing in which he reflected on the things we call good, or at least that we consider harmless. But he points out when they are taken to their extreme, they actually become the opposite. They actually become bad. Here are his illustrations of using earthly honor, riches, covetousness, and worldly omnipotence. And then he contrasts it at the end with love. Kierkegaard writes, "Carried to its extreme limit, what is pleasure other than disgust? What is earthly honor at its dizzy pinnacle other than contempt for existence? What are riches, the highest superabundance of riches, other than poverty? For no matter how much all the earth's gold hidden in covetousness may amount to, is it not infinitely less than the smallest mite hidden in the contentment of the poor? What is worldly omnipotence other than dependence? What slave in chains is as unfree as a tyrant? No, the worldly goal is not one thing. Diverse as it is, in life it is changed into its opposite, and in death it becomes nothing. In eternity it becomes damnation. Only the good is one thing in its essence and the same in each of its expression. Take love as an illustration. The one who truly loves does not love once and for all. Nor does he use a part of his love and then again another part. For to change it into small coins is not to use it rightly. No, he loves with all his love. It is wholly present in each expression. He continues to give it away as a whole, and yet he keeps it intact as a whole in his heart. Wonderful riches! When the miser has gathered all the world's gold and sordidness, then he has become poor. When the lover gives away his whole love, he keeps it entire, in the purity of the heart. I want to unpack a little bit of Kierkegaard's words. What is pleasure other than disgust? Indeed, the more we know of what we want and the more we know of what pleases us, the more we are aware of what disgusts us, the more we are cognizant of that which we find unworthy. What is earthly honor at its dizzy pinnacle other than contempt for existence? Indeed, don't we find this among the famous? That as they are given into this heightened sense of humanity, they become acutely aware of the limits that they have. What are riches, the highest superabundance of riches, more other than poverty? Yes, indeed, covetousness, which makes one continue to want more, always points out what one doesn't have. In the pursuit of riches, we become hyper-aware of our poverty. What is worldly omnipotence other than dependence? Yes, the world's greatest superpower. We have often been known as the greatest superpower. But then we have to have people depend on us for their existence. We need them to acknowledge that they can't make it without us. And thus we are always fighting to keep our place. Kierkegaard says, what slave in chains is as unfree as a tyrant? Indeed, a slave to be free need only break his chains. A tyrant, however, is chained to their constant display and demonstration of power. They literally can't let up on this for fear that they'll lose everything. But love, when taken to its extreme, only becomes more. It enriches, it strengthens, the giver, even as he or she gives it away. So Jesus is pointing out to his disciples, do not be fooled. Do not be fooled by tyrants and anyone who promises that they can give you the world that you want. Salvation does not come from the ways of this world. Do not be fooled. If they're using the weapons and power mechanisms and tools of this world, you're going to get a kingdom that will have its limits. It will have its life cycle. It will have its end. Do not be fooled into repeating the same strategies and expecting a different outcome. People will push these familiar tools to their own destruction. There will be earthquakes and famines, Jesus says. Sounds somewhat familiar. Among Christians, there has been talk for a good long time about whether or not we're in the end times. Michael and I went to a Christian college, and I remember people talking about the Gulf War as it was about to begin and saying, this is the beginning of the end. Well, those were many decades ago. But what if it is the beginning of the end? These are the beginning of the birth pangs, Jesus says. That means something new is going to be born. I remember in anticipation when we were expecting our first child, a woman whose kids were in my youth group told me of her experience in having their first child. And when her body started to take over to birth the child, her uterus contracting, which does all on its own, everything just starts to go into something that it seems to know how to do, and it hurt. And she said to the nurse, I don't want to do this anymore. She told the nurse, I don't want to have a baby anymore. I've changed my mind. And the nurse, she said to her, you can't change your mind. We are going to do this. We are going to help you, and you are going to get through it, and you are going to have a baby. And the way that she told this, she didn't give up to the nurse lightly. She came back a second time, maybe even a third, to say, oh no, I really don't want to, though. Isn't there something else we could do than this? Yes, any woman who has had a baby knows that to give birth, it takes over you. That you have an idea of what having a baby is like, but then your body does something that you cannot control. And you begin to submit to that because you don't really have a choice. It's doing something all on its own. You cannot decide whether it's a convenient time or not. You cannot slow it down. You cannot hurry it up. It does it all on its own. And when that baby is born, that baby takes on a life of its own. It is no longer something you can control and hide away. New life always takes on a life of its own. Perhaps this is what Jesus is warning his disciples of, or giving them a heads up about, wanting to say, this is the start of the birth pangs. Stuff will happen and you'll say, I really don't want this to happen though. Can't we just not have this happen? And honestly, I don't know to what value that conversation is, any more than the woman I know who was in labor could stop it. But we can consider, how do we work with the birth pangs? How do we participate, as each woman who gives birth has to learn how to do, to participate with the body in the way that the body is taking on a life of its own, so that all of it can work together for new life? This is the question, because we are faced with whatever it is we put into the world takes on a life of its own. My dear friends, we are in error when we forget this very truth. Everything we put into the world takes on a life of its own, whether we meant for it to go in that direction or not. We see this starkly in our news this week, with men who are on trial for carrying guns and killing people, who said, I wasn't trying to kill anyone. That wasn't my intent. Okay. But when you bring a gun into a highly tense environment, things can take a life on of their own. And they did take a life on of their own. Other variables came into play that you did not expect. This is the same thing with the January 6th insurrection. The whole thing took on a life of its own. Everything fed off everything else. That's what happens in life. We are ignorant if we forget this. We cannot script every moment of the future. We can only consider in what way we participate in life in the moment in front of us. It's up to any one of us, it's up to every one of us to put something new in the mix. We birth the moment. We give birth to the moment, and the moment grows. Every single person here, I would guess, is tempted in some way to take up violence to solve violence. It doesn't matter what side of the political line you're on. I don't stand in judgment of you. I know that all of us at one time or another don't live the values that we profess. That being said, the only ones who don't have that temptation to violence are the ones that know the transforming love of Jesus in their very lives. Jesus has removed that temptation and fortified them with transforming love. So they're not even having to address the temptation anymore. Jesus has removed it. This is the kingdom that we are invited to be a part of. You may have noticed in Hannah's song in 1 Samuel a keen familiarity to the Magnificat, Mary's song in Luke 2. I want to frame this for you and why it is that Hannah's words are significant. You see, she was barren, loved by her husband, but was not able to have children, and it was determined that women who couldn't bear children were of lesser value. She was shunned or at least diminished in her community, and so she took this to heart and prayed fervently that God might allow her to bear a child. She went to the temple and prayed in such a way that her mouth moved. And Eli, who was the priest, saw her and thought she was drunk, and he yelled at her to go away in her drunkenness. And she said, "No, no, no, I've come here to bring my prayer to God, who I know hears me." Eventually, Hannah did have a child, Samuel, and she dedicated him to the Lord. She gave him to the temple to serve under Eli, her first child, the one that she had longed for. But when it was that she became pregnant, this is the song that came out of her. "My heart exults in the Lord. My strength is exalted in my God." Listen to what she notices, that God, the bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble gird on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread because they always want more, but those who are hungry are fat with spoil. She notices the reordering. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low. He also exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. This is very similar to Mary's prayer, the Magnificat in Luke 2, and I commend it to you. You can go home and read. Samuel then became a good listener to God. You remember the boy Samuel who thought someone was calling him, and he went to Eli in the night, and finally Eli realized that it was God calling Samuel. It was Samuel who consecrated the first king of Israel, Saul. But Saul turned from God's ways, and God left him. God said to Samuel, "I want a new king because Saul has betrayed me and left me." And Samuel said, "Oh my goodness, please don't ask me to do this. If Saul finds out I'm searching for a new king, he'll kill me." And God said, "Trust me, Samuel." And so Samuel did find David, who became the greatest king of Israel and set history and our faith on a whole new trajectory. David even had his moment of abandoning God, but he repented and returned to the Lord, and that made all the difference. You see, my friends, the way toward freedom from the temptation to take up the ways of the world is through allowing Jesus to be king, the Lord of our lives, the Lord of my life, the Lord of your life. I know this sounds evangelical, and you might be saying, "Whitney, I know people who use that word, and they are not folks I want to be associated with. I'm looking for love to be demonstrated, and I'm not seeing it." And I would say, I agree. Because, as I just recounted to you in the kings of Israel, it's not the first time that God has removed God's blessing. You know, in Matthew 25, when people come before the judgment seat, Jesus tells this story. They will say, "Lord, Lord," and the judge says, "I don't know you. When did you feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit those in prison, heal the sick. We are always learning, always learning how to let God the Creator, known in Jesus, present in the Holy Spirit, to rule in our lives, to be King. It is a constant learning. With each new challenge, we learn again. I'm going to put some resources on our website tomorrow, right on the front page, that you might find helpful to you in this journey, because it is a lifelong journey. We are always faced with situations that challenge our confidence that love can actually make a new way. No matter how old we are or how long we've been following Jesus, we're always confronted with a new experience which calls us to faith and hope that love can actually make a way where there was no way. That's when the impossible becomes possible, and it happens in Christ. We realize that Jesus is the one that makes a way where there is no way. Jesus is the one that makes possible what is impossible. This is good news. This is why Jesus is good news. Amen.